Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute and this program under the aegis not only of the Institute, but the Baker Institute Science and Technology Program and the Baker Institute Student Forum. In the summer of 2002, a group of students approached me with the idea of forming a student leadership group that would closely work with the Baker Institute and involve more Rice students in our events and programming. Tonight's event is a direct result of their efforts to this commitment. As they will each be graduating next month, I would like to take a minute to recognize 5 of the original members whose ideas have become a reality. Emery Ellis, if he's here, you could stand, unless you're going to be totally embarrassed, who has also worked for the Baker Institute for the last 4 years and whose contribution to the Baker Institute has been invaluable. Naveen Vij, Dustin Steffens, Narayan Mulakutla, and Sean Leventhal, who was the first chairman of the Baker Institute. These guys and gals came to me all dressed in black one day. I thought it was a mafia scene. And they said, we want to establish a Baker Institute Student Forum, and can we have your support? And all these years later, the Baker Institute has been one of the greatest things that's happened to this institute because they've been a catalyst for student involvement. I'd also like to recognize Joe Kent, who first proposed bringing our distinguished speaker, John Podesta, to the Baker Institute, and Nurain Khan, who will assume the chairmanship of the Student Forum next semester. We are expecting great things from you, Nurain, as you lead the effort to greatly increase the membership of the Student Forum. Although we will miss each one of them, their inspiration will live on, and I wish you all the very best success in your future endeavors. It's now my pleasure to invite the Baker Institute's Senior Fellow for Science and Technology Policy, Dr. Neil Lane, who you all know, former Provost, former Science and Technology Advisor to President Clinton, who will introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. Join me in welcoming Neil to the podium.
Thank you very much, Ed. It is a real privilege for me to introduce John Podesta. In a way, I've been looking forward to this opportunity for a very long time. I know many of you have seen John's TV appearances, read his columns, looked in the daily website at the Center for American Progress, where John is president and CEO, and maybe reviewed this short biographical sketch. But let me just briefly summarize his background. I'll really have to be brief because John, as Chief of Staff, chaired the White House staff meeting every morning. And you had to be brief. You know, if you ran over 20 seconds, you really got clobbered. You also had to be relevant. Well, on the former and on the latter, I think he was unusually generous to me, and it gives me an opportunity to express my appreciation for that. So I think we got more science into the agenda than we would under any other leader in the White House. John received his education at Knox College and Georgetown University Law Center, where he's currently visiting professor, and in the offices of Washington, the halls of Congress. He knows the lobbying business and the business of government inside out. John was founder of a most successful public affairs firm with his brother Tony. And during the Clinton administration, as you know, John served in the first term as assistant to the president and staff secretary. He was the person that controls all of the correspondence, goes in and out of the Oval Office. He was senior policy advisor to the president on many technical issues. And in the second term, and that was the time I had a chance to be in the White House, he served as deputy chief of staff first, and then as the president's chief of staff, and a member of the cabinet, and a principal on the National Security Council. Now, some referred to John as the most powerful person in government short of the president, and certainly John never acted that way, but the description seems apt to me. In my time in the White House, I found John to be very tough, but supportive and fair. Now, you may be aware of his passion for technology and for roller coasters. The big ones, I think he's ridden most of the really super roller coaster at some point in his life, wherever they are in the world. And he also likes TV shows. West Wing, of course, which makes many of us nostalgic, I would say. But there's also the sci-fi show X-Files. This is about a government conspiracy to cover up the existence of extraterrestrials and where aliens show up from time to time. In fact, I understand at his 50th birthday party hosted by Bill and Hillary Clinton, the President and First Lady performed an X-Files skit and played a video in which the actual cast of X-Files sang happy birthday to John. So what's all this about? Well, on one occasion in the White House, maybe it was when I was involved in a skit, somebody twisted my arm, I commented that John was really not like the rest of us. He seemed to have an uncanny awareness of what was going on out of his immediate view. He had the penetrating eyes, which you'll see from up here, that seemed to see past whatever yarn you're trying to spin. He had this insatiable curiosity and a very impressive knowledge about things scientific and technological. He seemed to enjoy hearing a lot about UFOs and aliens. And then there's a roller coaster thing. Well, I was even so bold to suggest he is not from around these parts. So for what it's worth, let me suggest the following. The scientific evidence, so let me just put it that way, points to someone sent here with superhuman knowledge and skills, enormous energy and courage, and unrelenting passion to do good and make the world, the earth that is, a better place for people to live. Now that could explain the X-Files bit. As for the roller coasters, well, think of those roller coasters. They're all around the globe. They look like giant antennas. And if you think about those coupled in a large system, you could receive and send extraordinary information to all parts of the universe. So I think that completes the picture, at least as far as I've worked it out. So it's just a thought. I'm going to let you make up your minds. Last thing I want to say is that we put out a title earlier that would suggest John's going to talk about science, technology policy, which he is, and also that he was going to talk about the balance between knowledge and security, which he knows a lot about and has had great experience in. But we also told John, you can talk about anything you want to. So as you know from the program today, he's going to talk about energy. Please join me in welcoming the legendary John Podesta.
Well, that was quite a build-up. I think we created some new legends in that introduction. It really is a great pleasure and a great opportunity for me to be able to spend a few minutes here at the Baker Institute. And, Neil mentioned the West Wing, and probably some of you looking at the faces in the audience think that Leo McGarry was actually the first chief of staff in the White House. Actually, it's their chief of staff in the White House is actually a relatively modern invention. Goes back to the Eisenhower administration. But I think it's fair to say that in the last 50 years that there's been a modern chief of staff in the White House. Jim Baker certainly set the bar, which all the people who succeeded him have tried to match, and we've all fallen short. But he was one of the most effective public servants I think the country has had, and he certainly was one of the most effective chiefs of staff that the White House has ever known. And it gives me great pleasure to have actually gotten to spend a few months occupying that office down the hallway from the Oval Office. So I really particularly appreciate being here. And Ed Dirigian, I can't really tell you what a gift you have to be here at Rice. He is truly one of the most gifted diplomats that the country's known. He served in Republican and Democratic administrations. He served the Clinton administration with great distinction. He did it in a way, I think, that always put the country first, and it's great to be able to participate with you, Ed. So thank you for the invitation. I met a lot of wonderful people here today, great scientists and economists and other people doing work here. But I do have to talk a bit about my friend Neil. I got to know Neil during his tenure as the President's Science Advisor and before that as the Director of the National Science Foundation. He was a remarkable scholar, and he's made outstanding contributions, but I want to expand a little bit on Neil's introduction of me, and I'll give you a little introduction of him because you may not all know him quite as well as I do. First, on the serious, I think that as I toured today the nanotech lab, I think Neil deserves great credit for for the scaling up of nanotech research in this country. You know, President Clinton in 2000, I think, at Caltech announced the National Nanotech Initiative, and that was in fair measure as a result of the guidance that Neil gave him as the science advisor. And I think one other thing I would note is that I think that Dr. Lane always focused also on the societal impacts of science, not just the kind of whiz-bang efforts that science can produce, but what would it really mean for society. And I think that CBEN kind of follows in that tradition, and the fact that at least some of the money that's in the National Nanotech Initiative really flows out to try to study what the societal impacts will be, both good and bad, and to try to manage those as best we can in a democratic way, really as a result of the kind of effort and the work that he pioneered as the science advisor. But the one thing that Neil didn't tell you in telling you these stories about his coming to the Roosevelt Room to sit down in our staff meetings is he was fond of every now and then wearing a spacesuit into the Roosevelt Room. So I think by 2000, when then Governor Bush talked about restoring honor and dignity to the White House, he was actually talking about kicking Neil out of the White House and sending him back to Rice. After I received the invitation to join this discussion, and by the way, people said to me I could talk about anything I wanted to, and I felt like I couldn't come to Houston and not talk about energy. So you'll forgive me if I view science, I think, through a prism of the challenges that we face as a country and globally from the perspective of energy. So I'm going to talk about science policy, but I'm going to do it through that lens and that prism. And you have so many people here who know so much about that, from the Rick Smalleys to the Amy Jaffes of the world to Ed Dirigian. But that's the framework for my talk. But after I received the invitation to join in this discussion, one of the younger people on my staff in Washington asked why it was taking place here at Rice. And of course, the thought occurred to me, since I'm a little older and a little grayer than some of the people who work for me, how could it have really how can you have that discussion and happen anywhere else? As one of America's great teaching and research institutions, Rice, I think, has always been at the cusp of innovation. Well, unlike most of you, I'm old enough actually to still remember when President Kennedy came to Rice to challenge America to become what he called the world's leading spacefaring nation. And in a sense, that makes this discussion tonight all the more appropriate, because what President Kennedy understood was that mobilizing America's scientific community would not only enable us to unlock the mysteries of space, it would also add immeasurably to the nation's security and economic well-being, that one was the key to the other. And of course, he was right. Our victory in the Cold War was the triumph of America's oldest values and our newest technologies, technologies which not only took Americans to the moon and back, but which changed all of our lives for the better. Of course, again, if you're old enough, if you're as old as I am, it wasn't just the discovery of Tang, which became the favorite drink of those of us who were in high school at that time, and probably of science buffs around the world. I think it was the vision that President Kennedy put forward to take us into space that really unleashed a torrent of discovery that still affects our everyday lives and the everyday lives of Americans around the country. Let me just mention a couple of things. The Unistix controller developed for the lunar rover now enables extremely handicapped people to drive cars on the highway. Cordless drills, an everyday feature of our lives, were an offshoot, actually, of the equipment that enabled astronauts to take soil samples on the moon. The technology created to monitor the vital signs of astronauts during spaceflight now gives nurses and doctors the ability to carefully track the heart rates of their patients. And that's not even to even mention the communications revolution, which was unleashed by network computers, by global positioning satellites, by the new materials, high strength and lightweight, which you're at the cusp of developing a whole new generation of here at Rice. For any of those of you in the audience who was actually watching 60 Minutes last night, they did a whole segment on the future of single-person flight travel, so that we'd have highways in the sky. And one of the things that I learned from just tuning into that segment was that one of the reasons why people never really developed single-person, personal, mobile aviation devices was because there was no way to really manage the traffic flow if you put all those people up in the sky. But indeed, NASA now has developed a technique using GSP and other technologies in which you can kind of, like a video game, kind of get in the zone and actually keep apart from one another. So the program keeps giving and giving and giving. The success, I think, of the space program teaches that once we marshal our scientific and technological genius, we Americans not only are able to overcome our adversaries, in that case the Soviet Union, we also set loose forces of innovation that move our entire society forward. And I think that's really an important lesson to remember, because today I think America faces another challenge, a challenge that I believe poses as great a threat really to the safety and to the security of our country today and of the world indeed, as the Soviet Union did a half a century ago. That is what is at stake in the battle to win an environmentally sound and politically secure energy future. An energy future that sharply reduces the threat of global warming, an energy future that ends America's dangerous dependence on Middle East oil, an energy future that fosters sustainable economic growth, both in the United States and in the developing world, which I think is a very important factor in all of this. Today, there are 2 billion people who live on $2 a day. One of the great challenges that the world has made, that the UN has made in the form of the Millennium Challenge, is to try to have that by 2015. But there's a almost total overlap between those people and people who lack access to modern forms of energy. If those people are to be brought into the modern economy, lead decent lives for themselves and their children, one of the effects will be to, in fact, increase the demand for current technologies, particularly carbon-based technologies, and you see the run-up in the price of oil as a result of the Chinese into the market with a vengeance as being part of that, but it also really completely exacerbates the problem of global warming, which I want to spend a few minutes on. So tonight I want to discuss the energy future and what it's going to take to achieve it, how we can get from where we are now to a sensible R&D strategy that can improve energy efficiency, generate terawatts of carbon-free and low-carbon energy. We have to, because if I can borrow the often used and probably most famous words of NASA's Gene Kranz, failure is simply not an option. Today we know for a fact that the continued use of fossil fuels is dramatically escalating the risks of global climate change, and the problem is going to only get worse unless we change course. With only 4% of the world's population, the United States accounts for almost 25% of the world's CO2 emissions. The vehicles we use account for about a third of our overall CO2 emissions. In America, about 1.9 billion tons of CO2 in 2003. Unless we curb this pollution, average temperatures are predicted to rise from 2 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, from 1.4 to 5.8 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. Now, that may sound a lot worse in Houston than when I talk about this in Minnesota, but our own government studies indicate that an increase in temperatures of that magnitude would cause rising sea levels, threatening the coastal areas where 53% of Americans live, where more frequent and severe storms, the widespread destruction of ecosystems, more frequent heat rates and droughts, particularly in the country's interior. This is not off in the unforeseeable future. These are impacts which, in my view, although I think there's, at least on this point, there may be some scientific debate, we'll begin to see in the relatively near future, certainly in your lifetimes and certainly in the lifetimes of the children that you'll be raising. An October 2003 Pentagon report went further and urged that climate be elevated beyond a scientific debate to a U.S. national security concern, as catastrophic climate change would challenge United States national security in ways that should be considered immediately. If you think about the impact on the United States with its robust economic program, with its vast scientific knowledge, its ability to adapt to changing global circumstances, just think about the 80 million people or so who live in coastal Bangladesh or Indonesia that will be overwhelmed in what could be the relatively near future. The chances for environmental refugees changing the security dynamic around the world. Yet, I think instead of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and mitigating those security concerns that the Pentagon has called for, we've actually been compounding them, because we have done very little to bend the curve, to bend the technology curve towards carbon-free energy sources. Compounding the environmental challenge are the security and economic concerns that stem from our dependence on imported oil. So beyond these environmental concerns, we have additional security concerns, and Ambassador Dirigian has spoken and written a good deal about that. The fact remains that today we in the United States import now nearly 60% of our oil, 2.4 billion barrels a day from the Persian Gulf, over 1.6 million barrels from Saudi Arabia alone. It's predicted that between 2010 and 2020, 85% of the increase in oil production is likely to come from the Middle East. That's why, notwithstanding the oil shocks of the 1970s, the two wars we fought in Iraq in little more than 15 years, the global war against terrorism, the leverage that I think that the oil-rich regimes have is not contracting, it's actually growing as we sit here. Now, will it make a difference to our energy security if those regimes become more democratic? Well, we certainly hope that they will become more democratic. I think that's important for the security posture of the United States. But I don't know that our dependence on their oil will even pose less of a security risk if they become, in fact, more democratic. Because while it sounds good, there are democratic regimes today that become, with regard to the availability and dependability of continuous sources of oil, are somewhat suspect. To think about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or the situation in Nigeria, in which President Obasanjo was indeed the duly elected leader of the country. But that still doesn't make us any less dependent on regimes that constrain our ability to act. Now, faced with the threats posed by global warming and our dependence on fossil fuels, we might hope that our leaders in Washington could derive at some consensus. There today, President Bush spoke about this in his radio address this weekend. Today, in the House of Representatives, there's some consideration of an energy bill. But whether it's drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, capping CO2 emissions and other pollutants from power plants, revisiting where we are in nuclear power and the long-term plans for disposal of nuclear waste, or investing in solar or other renewable technologies, the debate in Washington seems to generate far more rancor than it does energy. While I think that's been true of the last several years, including at the end of the Clinton administration, where I think we did no better at forging a consensus for a national energy plan that got us on a more intelligent path. I think actually things are beginning to change. Amy Jaffe and I talked about the fact that last month Secretary Baker at the Houston Forum actually talked about focusing the attention of the country on this problem of global climate change. I think people thought that was a big change in what at least what the expectations were about what would happen in Houston, and certainly that that Secretary Baker would associate himself with dealing with that problem over the long term. Conservatives and progressives, industrialists and environmentalists, unions and employers are beginning to cautiously reach out to find common ground on a new energy policy. One of those efforts that I've been involved with is called the Energy Future Coalition. It's a broad bipartisan effort. It's led by a former Democratic Senator, Tim Wirth from Colorado, by C. Boyden Gray, who served as the first President Bush's White House counsel, and myself. We've tried to steer this bipartisan group that involves industry, unions, environmentalists to try to come up with a more far-reaching and a more innovative energy policy. Last month, we were proud to be joined by former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, President Reagan's National Security Director Robert McFarlane, Ambassador Crow, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, other military leaders, to urge President Bush, in the interest of Homeland Security, to boost tax incentives, to encourage Americans to buy hybrid cars and to use alternative fuels. We've called for the introduction of new technology that could economically produce more than 50 billion gallons per year of cellulosic ethanol. Some of the most important work is being done here at Rice to try to help us get on that path that could create the enzymes that are necessary to break down cellulose and provide a fuel stock to create a sound basis for more liquid fuel from renewable resources, which is America's vast agricultural abundance. That's only one example of, I think, the common ground we're beginning to carve out on energy policies. There are others. The Hewlett Foundation formed the National Commission on Energy Policy. It was co-chaired by Harvard scientist and climate expert John Holdren, by Bill Riley, who's a former Republican EPA administrator, and by John Rowe, who's the CEO of Exelon, one of the largest electricity producing companies in the United States. I think they did a terrific job, again, in a bipartisan way, of forging a consensus on a range of energy policy issues. They issued a series of recommendations that can help move our country out of the energy policy deadlock we're in today, and really go well beyond the kinds of ideas that are on the table in this so-called joint House and Senate energy bill forum that's taking place. They propose new incentives to produce and purchase super efficient vehicles I just mentioned. It's important that we invest in the manufacturing technology so that America can kind of not just be behind the curve in that regard, but retool to provide those kinds of vehicles here in the United States. They proposed a business-friendly and environmentally effective tradable permits program to limit overall greenhouse gas emissions. That takes the form in Congress of the so-called McCain-Lieberman bill, which has gotten some traction and is moving forward under the leadership of Senator McCain. They proposed the development of clean, efficient biofuels, such as cellulosic ethanol, which I mentioned, stronger efficiency standards for new appliances, equipment, and buildings. There's tremendous ability to pick that up if we get serious about it, and a serious effort to develop proliferation-resistant, cost-effective nuclear power technologies, as well as a secure long-term waste disposal option. That's a tremendous challenge. I've served on a citizens panel that oversaw a group led by John Deutsch and Ernie Moniz at MIT to try to determine the long-term possibility of making nuclear power once again a part of the solution, part of the suite of technologies that needs to be put together to create more security and long-term solution. But the ability to make that both proliferation resistant, as we're learning now in the challenge that we see in North Korea and other places, Iran, as well as the challenge to dispose of the waste, which we still haven't quite come to terms with, as Yucca Mountain continues not to be licensed to receive nuclear waste, are huge challenges, but there's some hope that new generations of technology might move forward there. I should add that we are not only seeing advocates coming together in this country, but I think this is happening now globally as well. Again, Amy told me that Secretary Baker had just been to Europe and had gone through a series of meetings at European think tanks before he came back and talked at the Houston Forum. Who knows whether one may have influenced the other. My organization, the Center for American Progress, joined forces with think tanks in Australia, the Australia Institute, and a British think tank called IPPR, to organize the International Climate Change Task Force. That effort was co-chaired by Senator Olympia Snowe, a Republican senator from Maine, and Stephen Byers, a member of Parliament who's close to Tony Blair, had served in his cabinet, is now engaged in his own re-election effort as part of Blair's effort to be his election effort that culminates in early May. The task force brought together scientists, political leaders, business and environmental leaders, not only from the U.S. and Europe, but from Brazil, from China, from India, to come forward with some new ideas about what we could do together globally in that regard. We issued a series of recommendations, which I think have been very well received by Prime Minister Blair, who chairs the G8 this year and will host the meeting of the G8 governments in the UK in June. He also, assuming he's reelected, which I think the good money is still that he will be reelected, he'll also chair the EU presidency in the second 6 months of this year. And some of these ideas have been picked up by the British government, and they're trying to work with the U.S. government to move forward in this. We agreed that the world needed to come together on a goal of the global average temperature not rising by more than 2 degrees centigrade from the pre-industrial age, which is an important political commitment, which the EU has now taken on and the UK have taken on, but that the rest of the world needs to take on as well. We called on G8 governments to take effective steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That includes setting a target that all G8 nations generate at least 25% of their electricity from renewables by the year 2025. You might be surprised to learn that's really been embraced by broad segments of the U.S. agricultural community, who see the production of energy, both from the kind of bio-liquid fuels that I talked about, as also with regard to production of wind as a source of electricity, as an important goal for the future of U.S. agriculture. And of course, I think the work that Rick Smalley is doing make all of that something more of a reality. Of course, one recommendation common to all the efforts that I've described is to call for increased funding for energy research, development, demonstration, and early deployment. Now, I know my saying that here is preaching to the converted, particularly to the people who are engaged in the nanotech and some of these other initiatives. But let me tell you why I think that more research is overdue and about the kinds of remarkable economic returns it can generate. First, federal funding for R&D is down by 60% since 1978. Thanks to Neil's help, I think we began to really kind of bend the curve, particularly on a broad base of R&D funding. Total funding for energy R&D in all areas, end-use efficiency, fossil fuels, fission, fusion, renewables, energy storage, energy transmission, is only $1.7 billion a year. So compare that, if you will, to what NIH budget is of $28.7 billion a year. Again, we struggled. Dr. Lane and I spent many hours on Capitol Hill struggling to make sure that the entire suite of scientific enterprise was funded. At that time, most of the money, I think, was being siphoned away from basic, particularly what I guess we refer to as the hard sciences and onto medical research. And one of the cases that we constantly made is you can't make advancements in medical research unless you can have advancements in computer technology and materials in the hard science and physics and chemistry. That's where the future of medical innovation really lies. But when you have such a distorted and imbalanced portfolio, it's harder to convince a young creative graduate student, I would say. You probably, many of you in the audience would know this better than I do, or an assistant professor to take on the Apollo project of clean energy for the 21st century. If they see where all the money's going from one side of the ledger over to the other, I think you can expect that talent will follow. I mentioned earlier the question of nuclear power. One of the things that's happened in that world is there's been kind of a brain drain out of the particularly out of the academic community, as people said, well, there's no future in this, where there's no point in my devoting my life to that sort of enterprise. But so critical to get people back into these sectors. Second, the private sector is also underinvesting in R&D. Private sector energy R&D has fallen from $4 billion in 1990 to $2 billion today. It's 0.3% of sales, one of the least R&D intensive sectors of our economy, which is rather remarkable if you consider the challenges we faced. Third, the world would benefit from radical improvements in energy efficiency and clean energy. We need a better set of energy options than the ones we have on the table. Remember, we want to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, expand the global middle class, reduce the risk of global climate change, and preserve our environment for future generations. But we've got to do this all at the same time. It's quite a challenge. But if we're serious about this, if we mobilized our best scientists and most talented engineers, our most creative entrepreneurs, if we got a bus, I think we need a plane, brought some of our leading leaders in Congress and took them down and took them through the labs here that I got to experience today, I'm convinced that both we could solve the problem through greater investment, and I think we could maybe get the attention of the political leadership in the country. My friend Amory Lovins at the Rocky Mountain Institute says that climate change and energy futures, although seems catastrophic, is actually a business opportunity disguised as a calamitous environmental problem. One of the things that gives me hope are the breathtaking advances that we're making in biotechnology and information technology and nanotechnology, and the virtuous circle of innovation that emerges at the convergence of bio, info, and nano. And I should say, after having been to CBEN, that I have to include environmental science on that. They have 4. I only have 3 in terms of the convergence of trying to work these problems simultaneously. Let me give you a few examples. Scientists at Berkeley and MIT are creating a new discipline called synthetic biology, leveraging the ability to not only decode genomes, but to synthesize long sequences of DNA. Although this technology has obvious risks, Kristen Kulikowski, who I met earlier, has called this going from the wow factor to the yuck factor. Going from the wow of the technology to the yuck of what it might do to society, to the environment, etc., which we need to manage. But that kind of technology can help us create the genetically engineered bacteria that are capable of turning corn husks into biofuels. That's the future we need to get to, and those are the kinds of investments we need to make. Several research groups and companies around the country are using nanotech already to make low-cost solar cells, which could make solar more competitive with fossil fuels. And, of course, your own Nobel laureate, Dr. Rick Smalley, has described how nanotechnology, in addition to sending us all up in space on an elevator, could play a role in dramatic improvements in fuel cells, energy storage, and the electric grid of the 21st century. It's truly amazing and exciting. Smart dust, tiny wireless sensor networks that can measure light, humidity, and room occupancy are being commercialized by a number of high-tech startups. These advances in information and communications technology have the potential to dramatically improve energy efficiency, even in retrofitted buildings, in retrofitted situations. It's not just the new, best green buildings, which I have no doubt that this building is an example of, but in older buildings, you could have dramatic improvements in efficiency by retrofitting with these new technologies. So I'm optimistic about the potential of advances in science and technology. But I think we do have to take a hard look at the current politics of energy research, development, and deployment. In the President's latest budget, which increased funding for hydrogen research, the so-called Freedom Car at the Department of Energy, Yet it cuts funding for the DOE's Office of Science budget by 4.5%. It cuts renewable energy by 7%. We're under great strain now. We have a structural deficit somewhere in the $400 to $500 billion range. So all these programs that are important to the future of our country and our economy are under great pressure. And while hydrogen may ultimately be important, the challenges associated with low-cost hydrogen production and storage are daunting, I think particularly in the transportation sector. So the Freedom Car is a long ways off. And in the meantime, we've got to do better, both better investment in these long-term solutions, but also introduction of technologies that are really in the here and now, those hybrid cars, et cetera. It makes much more sense also to invest in a broad portfolio of energy technologies and research directions, such as expanding our production and use, as I said, of hybrid and electric vehicles, as well as developing these so-called fuel cell vehicles in the future. I should also point out that the enormous federal budget deficit, as I said, is making it harder to consider not just federal investment, but also public-private partnerships and increased investment in high-risk, high-return energy R&D. If you think about it, the kinds of developments that are going involved in the labs down the street, if you're a business investor, you have to have stockholders who are really going to take the long view with the notion that they're going to put money into something that may not pay off for 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years in the future. Might have a spectacular payoff, but that's a very long term to put business sector money without federal leverage and federal support, or indeed state leverage and state support. And I will say one thing. I've been pretty bipartisan tonight, especially for me. But I will say one thing in a somewhat more partisan vein, which it doesn't help when Republican congressional leaders reflect the attitude of one of the leading GOP pollsters. I'm talking about a fellow named Frank Luntz, whose advice to them regarding global warming is to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue for the debate, to keep people's eyes off the ball. Well, the problem is not the clarity of our science, I think, but the failure of our policymakers to accept it. They confuse a range of outcomes with the certainty of the direction of the outcome, and that's a very important problem, to turn your head away from really what the scientific facts are, and to delude yourself in advice from linguists and pollsters about how you can sell a contrary, an alternative view. That's why I think it's never more important for members of the scientific community and the public policy community to make their voices heard. Neil has often spoken of the need of researchers to become what he called civic scientists who can play an integral role in our policy debates. Rick Smalley is a perfect example. He's been urging the United States to take on the challenge of producing a minimum of 10 terawatts of carbon-free energy by 2050 and recently testified to that effect in Congress. Of course, Ambassador Dirigian and others at the Baker Institute have put that work into a larger geopolitical and energy security context with regard to a world of volatile oil prices and dangerous dependence on Middle East oil. There are also powerful voices making reasoned arguments that our leaders really need to listen to. But I think it's up to all of us, you particularly, the young people in the audience, the students in this audience, to see to it that politicians' feet are held to the fire. That may sound unusual coming from me. I kind of sat there as the chief of staff in the White House, but believe me, I think that whether you could have an important commitment to program, a deep set of beliefs, but the voices of citizens are heard, even at the highest levels of government, and people do respond to it. Not far from here, on land donated by Rice University, is NASA's Johnson Space Center. It's impossible to go there without, I think, being awestruck. But even more awe-inspiring is the vision that gave rise to it. It was a vision described best, I think, by Lyndon Johnson himself. President Johnson once said that what America is all about is the uncrossed desert and the unclimbed ridge, the star that is not reached and the harvest that is sleeping in the unplowed ground. Creating sound new energy technologies and putting them to work for our nation and the world. That's the uncrossed desert for our generation and for your generation of Americans. And that's our harvest still sleeping in the ground. So I hope you get at it. The country needs you. They need not only your academic prowess, your ability to think these big thoughts, to think about the next generation of technology, but they really need your civic engagement, whatever discipline you're in and studying here at Rice. They need your ability to demand more from the government, to make the government focus on the most important issues facing and pressing the country, to come up with creative alternatives, and that'll only come from citizen engagement. So in closing, let me call you to that effort and that endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, John. John said he's willing to take a few questions, and I have some questions on these cards, or I'll invent some if I don't like what I have here, but we have some very good questions. So since you like to juggle several things at the same time, let me just put a couple of these together. So first, how would you define a progressive approach to energy policy with regard to such issues as ethics, funding, foreign policy, and sustainability? And then as a corollary maybe to that, do you suggest raising taxes on energy consumption to stimulate investment or change behavior? Or if not, how else do you change behavior and encourage innovation?
I think that let me take on the first. I think that, again, what I tried to say is that I think that perhaps what distinguishes, in my mind, a progressive approach has broadened out into and we've worked with guys like Boyd and Gray on this, but that is to try to think about energy from the perspective of not only the immediate price at the pump, which is of great concern to the American people, but also to what the future commitments are that we have to society, to a society not only in the United States but society around the globe. So I think that what we have tried to do is to link these, if you will, interlinked problem of trying to think about economic growth that proceeds along a path that is not the 20th century path for how the developing world developed with regard to energy, but that can vision out in a way that represents the aspirations of people around the world, and in a way that recognizes that growth is important. It's important to our own security, but it's also important to social equity around the globe, and to do it in a way that, again, builds on these technological solutions and doesn't exacerbate other societal problems. I'm not sure I would call that progressive versus conservative. We've attracted some support for that idea from the right as well as from the left, but I think that's how we approach the matter. With regard to taxes, in the first budget resolution that President Clinton passed, we did actually raise taxes on energy. We put, I think, if my memory serves me right, a 5 cent a gallon increase on gasoline tax. And some people think that the president paid a hit, took a hit for that the 1994 elections had something to do with the failure of the health care proposal. I talked to some of the students about that earlier. Some of it for the fact that economic proposal actually increased taxes, and particularly gasoline taxes, to some extent, and that the Congress, some of the congressional elections, might have been affected by that. But I think, again, if you reflect back, it also led to we came into office with budget deficits in the federal government of $300 billion as far as the eye could see. We did bend that curve, produced both declining deficits, and then in a bipartisan agreement in 1997, a balanced budget agreement that created a surplus, led to the longest economic growth in the country's history, led to rising wages, rising standards of living. So sometimes you have to be willing to take the heat and be prepared to call for increased taxes, particularly on things like energy, which I think could actually spur some innovation. I think in this case, though, the more likely path, and the one that we've called for, is essentially the one that I outlined when I described the McCain-Lieberman bill, which is rather than proceeding from taxation on the fuel source to create a so-called cap-and-trade system in which you limit the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that can be emitted by the U.S. economy, and over time, through market mechanisms, through market trading mechanisms, et cetera, you place a value on that. Some people think that's a fancy way of calling that a tax, but actually you're creating a system in which you're gradually, over time, through the most efficient ways and through market mechanisms that will produce the most efficient technologies, will actually begin to change the portfolio and the suite of technologies we use, put a premium on the high-emitting technologies. That's worked with regard to acid rain. The first experiment with that occurred in the 1990 Clean Air Act, which again seized the problem and said we want to reduce acid rain being emitted from power plants in the country, and we ought to do it in a way that just puts an overall cap on SO2 emissions in that context and gradually reduces them using the market mechanism. It's worked very well. It's been extremely efficient. It hasn't caused major economic dislocation. I think probably with regard, again, to this, particularly to the climate change challenge, I think that that cap-and-trade system, which will line up with what the Europeans are doing and others, is probably the more likely approach that the U.S. will take rather than putting a hard tax on energy.
What's a developing nation really supposed to do to develop sustainability while it also at the same time has to compete in a global market? So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's a huge challenge, and I think that there's sort of two tiers to that. One is the big developing nations, if you will, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils of the world, that are rapidly industrializing, rapidly moving, the major increases in energy usage. They have their own security issues with regard to keeping their energy supplies secure and empowering their economies forward. But they add significantly to this problem of CO2 emissions. It's just to repeat one statistic. We have 4% of the world's people. We account for 25% of the CO2 emissions. But China will pass us sometime in the 2020s or 2030 if they take the same energy path that the U.S. has taken. There's rapid introduction of automobiles in that economy as well as in India. There's a lot of two-stroke vehicles being introduced in those big developing economies, in both two-wheel and two-stroke vehicles, motorbikes, motorcycles, etc. And so that there's a commitment I think we have globally to try to get those countries on a different path, a low carbon or a no carbon path towards energy security or energy future. And I think that at some level and I think if you visit with your colleagues from those developing countries, if you've had Indian scientists or economists or Chinese scientists or economists or people from Brazil come here, they're one of the things that I think they'll say to you is, well, you've kind of eaten up the whole carbon budget that the world has in developing your economies, and why should we restrain our growth and the development of economic opportunity for our people by pricing energy higher, costing energy higher. And I think there's the answer to that has to be that we share a common problem. We share a common environmental problem, but that the developing world as well as the developed world as well as the developing world has a stake in seeing that path develop in a sort of different way. There's some innovative ideas about how to do that through both global financial institutions. Again, one of the things that I think will be on the table at the G8 is Tony Blair's commitment towards economic growth in the developing world and do it in a sustainable way. The conference that was held in Johannesburg a year ago talked about public-private partnerships. But those economies have a different problem, and they impact climate change much more than the least developed countries. If you go my daughter right now is in Lesotho in southern Africa. I mean, I think that they have a different kind of challenge with regard to energy. They're never going to be major emitters of CO2 in some of those economies, or not for a very, very long time. And yet they have an energy security challenge as well, which is that most of their hard currency is now going to importing oil and providing some support for more sustainable development in that regard, both from private sector sources and private capital sources, as well as from direct development assistance from the developing world, could help, I think, introduce more sustainable technologies, which I think has promised to lift living standards in that area as well.
Here may be the two that are somewhat related. First of all, what can Rice students and other young people and concerned citizens do to help leaders call for a Manhattan Project or an Apollo program, as you described it, to deal with this energy issue? And I relate a little bit to this other question, which says, I think this is somebody who might be interested in your work in your center. In fact, there's a resume on the back. Do you need policy experience? I mean, a real on the ground experience in policy work to work in your center, or with somebody with academic background, professional experience in science, technical fields, and an interest in progressive public policy be welcome? So, what
Give
can
me the
young
first
people?
one again.
Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
the first one?
Second one.
No,
First
I got
one.
the second one. What's the first one?
Oh, the first one is, what can Rice students, other young people do to launch this Apollo program, Manhattan Project? Or is that a good idea? Do we really need a project on that scale, at that level of visibility? And stuff?
Well, I think that the interesting thing is that the American people are ready for it. I mean, I think if I've looked at obviously a lot of survey research on this, I think that one of the projects I didn't mention was actually dubbed the Apollo Project for Energy. That was a coalition of business, labor, environmental groups that put forward a different vision of energy and a rapid introduction of new energy technologies. One of the reason the unions were engaged with that was that there's a tremendous opportunity, I think, to inject new technology into the electric grid, into the automobile manufacturing process, into energy efficiency, and there are a lot of jobs, a lot of U.S. jobs built into that. It's funny that our political leadership, I think, has failed to pick that up. I've lived through two presidential campaigns now in which on my side of the aisle, in which two great environmental leaders, first Vice President Gore and then Senator Kerry, who had tremendous expertise and commitment to these questions, I think got spooked off of it. I actually understand 2000 a little bit better than 2004 because I think that the vice president carried some baggage of being a guy who cared about the environment at the expense of the economy. I don't believe that was true, but I think that there was at least some thought that was an issue that could be exploited against him. But I think they kind of micromanaged their states in a way that in that case that failed to kind of, I think, project a vision of where the country could go. In Senator Kerry's case, maybe it was just that overall the campaign got off kilter and off centered by first his introduction at the convention, the Swift boat ads, the almost total focus on terrorism, and he never could really articulate a vision there. But it seems to me that there was a tremendous opportunity. The public's hungry for it. As president, I started with President Kennedy. As President Kennedy, I think, demonstrated an optimistic vision of the country that marries economic growth, job creation, new technology, and security is a very, very powerful vision that can produce votes and I think produce political victory. And I think, quite frankly, I say this here in Texas, I think the president was quite vulnerable on this set of issues in terms of what he carried into the campaign, his coming out of the oil sector and the Cheney Energy Task Force and the solutions that came up with, which was really looking backwards rather than forward. But it didn't happen. But I think the American public's ready for it, and I think that young people can demand that of their political leadership, and I think political leaders, I think it's no coincidence, I think that Senator McCain has picked this up. I think he heard people out on during his travels around the country. I don't think he started off as a big, he didn't meet with 7 scientists and decide that he really wanted to become a champion of this new approach on energy. I think he, in his travels around the country, I think he heard loud and clear that a different path was important. So I think students can really be helpful in effectively organizing on that. With regard to our place and the way young people can enter public policy, maybe it's just a factor that we're new and therefore we pay less well than our Republican counterparts or our conservative counterparts at the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute and those other places. But we have a lot of young people who come both as interns as young professionals. I've got my whole first crop of graduates already. We started a little less than 2 years ago, and I've got I'm losing a bunch of people who stuck with us for 2 years, had, I think, a tremendous experience. They at least claim to me that they're all happy, who are going off to Berkeley and Princeton, and fortunately one of them to Georgetown, or I'd be in trouble, to Yale and to other places to continue to their education, to continue their careers. But I have no doubts that they're going to stay in the public loop. I mean, they're people that we hired right out of college who did. Again, when you're a new institution, you give people a little bit more authority than when you're old and barnacled, I think. And so I think they had a terrific experience, but they're now moving on to law school and public policy school and graduate programs in economics and even one in the sciences. But I think they'll stay in. I mean, they've got a taste for that you can affect change through public policy, through work in Washington, through work in state capitals and at the local level around the world if you demand change. But you got to get in there and fight it.
Okay, quick answer, and then you get to eat. From a management perspective, what kind of advice did you get from your predecessor as Chief of Staff, and what advice did you give to Andy Card when he came in?
That's a great question. I have never been asked that before. I had the good fortune of, I served under 3 chiefs of staff in the Clinton administration. First, Mac McLarty, who comes out of the energy business, actually, ran a natural gas company in Arkansas. Then Leon Panetta, and then Erskine Bowles. I went in a kind of odd-sounding title called staff secretary. I managed all the paper flow. Only Ed would understand this because he's worked in big bureaucracies. But I managed the White House paper flow to and from the president. And so I got to serve under different chiefs of staff, and I learned from all of them. And I actually got some good advice from some of my Republican predecessors, including Secretary Baker, from time to time. But Erskine, who I served as deputy, gave me the best advice, and maybe it's worth passing on, which is he said, you got to slow down and listen. And I really took that to heart. Neil said that you could only speak for 20 seconds in any of my meetings. And I grew up in Chicago where you're fast talking, so I expected that from everybody else. But I concluded that if there was a meeting in which I was doing most of the talking, the meeting wasn't worth having. That the real purpose of, and if you sit around with Neil Lane and, to not to show off, but to seriously, every morning in my office, to Bob Rubin and Larry Summers and Gene Sperling and Sandy Berger and other people, it was important to just slow down and listen. And that's probably pretty good advice for any business or any CEO or any leader. I think a lot of people shoot from the hip. They don't listen to their staff. And if you need to have a talent for bringing in talented people, but then you got to slow down and listen to them. In terms of the advice I gave to my successor, he didn't really probably need any advice because he had served as deputy chief of staff in the first Bush administration, Andy Card. The one thing I did say to him because I think it was a little bit different during our tenure, and I don't know that he's taken my advice, although I do think that they established the same relation. The White House actually has two really functioning chiefs of staff. The National Security Advisor runs their own operation, really. And we've seen people get in trouble when those two operations go off in separate ways. I had about 500 people working directly under my pyramid in the White House office, and as well as Office of Management Budget has another 1,000 people, but they have their own leadership. National Security Council has about 150 people that serve there. They set the agenda on the foreign policy side. They have to integrate work from a communications perspective, from a budget perspective, from a priorities perspective, from a scheduling perspective. If the president's in Belarus, he's not in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and all those things can get really cranky if they're not well integrated. So I had the pleasure of working with someone who I had known for a long time, who I respected. I think he respected me. I served as a principal on the National Security Council, and Mr. Berger during my tenure served at my management committee table, and I think we kept things pretty well integrated. Now, probably Andy already knew that because he had worked with John Sununu, and he had worked with other people. He'd worked in the Reagan administration. So, and when Donald Regan, who's legendary chief of staff in the Reagan administration during Iran-Contra, served there, I think things kind of broke down, and I think probably even he would agree with that. Certainly, most other outside observers would agree with that. That the work between what was going on in the White House Chief of Staff's level and what was going on in the National Security Council really just kind of broke down, and I think it led to some disastrous results for the country. So keeping that integration between the foreign policy and the domestic policy and economic policy, where my expertise, to the extent I had any, was really integral, I think, to the effective functioning of the White House. Now, if you're on West Wing, Leo McGarry doesn't have to worry about that because they didn't even have a national security advisor for the first 2 years. He just did it all, and then they don't have a
science advisor either.
They don't have a science advisor either.
Last question, since you got into it. Who's your favorite character on West Wing, and is it really that hectic all the time?
Well, Neil, you could answer the second question. Well, the guy I've gotten to know best absolutely is the Chief of Staff, John Spencer, who I've become friendly with. Once in a while, they actually do call us up. Those of us who are refugees, they have a few consultants. Dee Dee Myers, Gene Sperling for a while I think still does it, who is our national economic advisor. Kent Duberstein, was very helpful to me, who was President Reagan's last chief of staff as an advisor to West Wing. So they actually do get some people who've kind of been there, and then every now and then they get stumped on a plot line, and they'll call me up. One of the Vice President Gore's chief speechwriter is one of the chief writers for the show, and so they know who we are, and they'll call us every now and then. With regard to the hecticness of it, I think there's two things. I'll leave you with these thoughts. The one thing that the West Wing does, which almost no other modern portrayal of politics and public life does, is that the people in the jobs are not cynical. They really care and believe in what they're doing. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether you're John Podesta or Andy Card or I won't put myself in the company with Jim Baker, but whatever your politics are, I think the people who are in the White House really believe they're trying to do the best for the country. And that show captures that. And it's a very odd portrayal of American politics. It's much more, almost every other movie, television show, etc. People are cynical. They're only there for their own self-aggrandizement, and frankly, that's really just not been my experience. And the other thing that it does is things come at you that you never predict. I mean, I sometimes use the line of walking out my front door and waking waking up and getting the Washington Post and seeing two identical sheep heads on the front page of the Washington Post when Dolly was first cloned. And, you know, I don't think anybody thought that we were going to be spending the next month spending most of our time on cloning until that incident happened. And things just fly at you, whether they're from the domestic side or from the foreign policy side, whether it's a natural disaster or, you know, a new problem that you didn't predict. They fly at you, and the show captures that. But people don't run around quite as much physically in the White House.
The sets are not quite right? The corridors are not that wide. The office.
The West Wing is a house. It was built, you know, the White House is a house. It's a place where people live. And the West Wing was modeled, the Oval Office is modeled after probably the nicest room in the entire White House, the yellow Oval Room, which is the kind of main parlor in the White House. The Truman balcony sits off of that room, and the Oval Office was modeled after that, because President Teddy Roosevelt, I believe, thought it was his favorite room in the White House, so he wanted to replicate it as his office. And in the West Wing is their back stairs, and you run up and down, and it feels like it's different than any other modern working environment. You're all working together in like one house. And usually you get along. Sometimes you want to kill each other, just like any house.
I want to thank the students for bringing John here, and I want to thank John for taking his time to come. Please join me.